Words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen.
Amen.
Is St. John the Baptist a queer superhero? He sure showed up in this world in a different way for the sake of truth and love. Though what I want us to hear before we dig into John's goodness is this. The word queer has 3 definitions, at least 3. The first one means just plain strange. It was a derogatory term aimed toward people on the LGBTQ+ spectrum before it was reclaimed. It emerged in the late 19th century, but that doesn't make us exempt from its painful linguistic legacy. Its reclamation process has worked. So, queer in its first sense is out of date, at least in New York City, which doesn't speak for the whole country, nor the whole world. But in our city, queer means something amazing, particularly something that disrupts our expected binaries. And that's the fruit of much emotional and intellectual labor. Again, the first definition is the historic one, which got reclaimed by queer activists, artists, academics, and people of faith. For example, about 15 years ago, my spouse and I were part of a project called Believe Out Loud. It was based nearby at Marble Collegiate Church, and even though we weren't members there, we supported BOL events, and I wrote blogs for their website. In short, our collective labor helped LGBTQ+ identified Christians to accept ourselves. There was even a church finder on the site which helped folks in our community to find affirming churches in their area. Now, such a site would be normal today, I know, though back then it was leading edge, I promise. I can remember James, Allison, and Joseph, the leaders of the project, and how I would look at them, like at a pride march, and just think, I'm seeing a living saint. That's how brave this work was then. And you know what? It still is brave because it's rooted in truth and love, the same principles which formed our blessed gospel. The second definition is the one that reclaims this bad term and turns it into something good. For those of us who are on the LGBTQ spectrum and those who stand by us, thank y'all so much, by the way. It typically means that someone carries one or more identities that don't obey social norms and expectations linked to gender and sexuality. I'd say that because the LGBTQ spectrum is so huge, sometimes it's simplest to think of it in terms of negation. If someone says, I'm queer, then they're likely either non-straight, non-cisgender, or both at once. Maybe they're still sorting that out, aka questioning, and that's totally okay. Some of us spend our entire lives figuring this stuff out. The third definition is the one in evolution. The word queer is still evolving along with us humans who use it. This third definition means anything that goes against social norms and expectations for the sake of truth and love. That includes notions related to gender and sexuality, though, as the song from the musical Porgy and Bess says, it ain't necessarily so. It could interface with my gender expression or yours, my romantic life or yours, though that's not necessarily so. Again, this third definition could have everything to do with gender and sexuality, or it could deal with these topics in an oblique way. Though, to be fair, these topics tend to show up wherever we go. That's largely why we have titles like queer theology, queer virtue, queer ethics, queer space, and so on. I'm sorry to tell y'all this, but none of these terms actually mean taking your clothes off with someone you love or changing what's underneath them. Rather, they're referencing how a subject, often an academic one, gets queered over time, namely when it intersects with queer culture. More broadly still, these titles reference how a subject gets queered over time since it's rooted in truth and love. Some of y'all are hearing this pattern. The kind of truth and love that's asked of us when we live from our true selves. And I don't know about you all, but I cannot live authentically without God's help. So, is the Bible, by that last definition, queer? Yes, it is. Yes, it is, friends. Much of the Bible turns our norms and expectations upside down and inside out for the sake of truth and love. And it doesn't regularly deal with who someone sleeps with or what their anatomy is to accomplish this task. We can read verses such as, "The first will be last, and the last will be first." Matthew chapter 20, verse 16, or "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." Matthew chapter 5, verse 5, to know we're dealing with a queer text. And we don't have time now to get into what went down when Jesus started resurrecting corpses. That was a subversive thing to do, for death is the supreme social norm and expectation, right? This book, it documents Jesus magic. It's not sorcery on our end, to be clear, yet it is the kind of magic that our Yeshua does. Wait a minute. What does that mean? It means that he takes this fallen world in which we all function, and by virtue of being God, he does something big. He does something that not even Houdini could do. He turns this fallen world right side up. Let me preach that again. We need to hear that, right? Jesus turns this fallen world right side up. The magic that happens on these pages, it transcends earthly magic. Earthly magic leads us to manipulation. But this is a magic that comes from heavenly light, for it makes everything right. If not in this world, then in the world to come. Therefore, Jesus of Nazareth is deeply queer. And he had a queer counterpart, his cousin St. John. In light of John's feast day, I suggest that along with doing the highest kind of heavenly magic, Jesus was queer since he didn't fit into the norms and expectations of his day. We don't know much about Jesus' relationship status. We don't even know if it was complicated. The canonical Gospels don't really spill the tea, nor do the non-canonical ones. I've read some recent work that says that Mary Magdalene was Jesus' lady love, but I cannot find enough textual evidence to support that claim. Being a romantic myself, I sort of wish that this were true. Were Jesus and Mary star-crossed lovers? Yet there just isn't much proof around that thought. And assuming that the Bible is more for our liberation than it is our oppression, why would those who wrote it hold out on us? Also, for that day and age, even in 2026, is it more of a liberation story? If Mary was solely his disciple, then the story goes, he didn't want anything from her other than her total liberation. Wow. Within a hetero context, or anyone for that matter, that's queer. That turns our assumptions about what men often want from women on their heads. Maybe they didn't make love. Maybe they made a path for those of us, billions of us, who would one day follow the way. So let's suppose that Jesus the Christ and John the Baptist were single, celibate men. This would be queer for their time and also queer for today's Jewish social norms and expectations, namely for rabbis. Along with being members of St. Bart's, my spouse and I are members of a queer synagogue. And so I've been around a lot of church and synagogue culture. What I know from lived experience is this. Traditionally speaking, in Judaism, it's easier then and now to become a rabbi who's married, unless someone is serving in a really progressive framework. Being a spouse, first and foremost, is built into the Jewish cultural mindset. The norm and expectation has historically been this. If one is to be a spiritual authority, namely the senior rabbi of a movement, then it's better for them to be married and hopefully a parent too. Emotional maturity and an established home life have customarily been prized. Is this reverse ageism, as it might take years to achieve these aims, if you want to? Aren't there great young unmarried rabbinical candidates? Yeah, perhaps it's ageist, though honestly, I also get it. If someone is going to lead you in the spiritual realm, then does it make sense for them to have more experience in the physical realm? Look, that isn't always true. And in the Jesus movement at large, we've welcomed priests and pastors who are married and unmarried, though that's been the historic mindset in Judaism. That's the vibe in which these men lived and moved and had their being, not only as celestial figures, but also as earthly ones. Because you know what? No matter who you are in heaven, once you get to earth, you need to conform to the society in which you live. Or do you? We might agree that Jesus the Christ, and John the Baptist, who led his followers to his cousin, Jesus, worked in a way that already made it unsafe for them to minister. From what the Bible shares, these men ministered to people before starting a family. Actually, the people to whom they most ministered became their chosen family. What is going on here? Never mind that St. John was also conceived by a miracle, and never mind that he's thought by some to be a Nazirite, which is a belief grounded in Luke chapter 1, verse 15, and never mind that he spoke in a way that ended his life. These realities make him triply queer. John is a super queer superhero. But if we only center the truth that these holy men were single, dayenu, as it said in Hebrew, that would have been enough. Dayenu, it would have been enough that they didn't allow their folks to arrange a marriage for each of them. Dayenu, that they weren't making babies before they claimed to know a thing or two about Torah. Dayenu, that they ministered in a wild way, with both of them spending time in the arid desert. John was different. Rumor has it that he didn't even cut his hair or shave. These men were so different. Many of us here may resonate with that fact. You know what? God favors the different. Not when it's different for the sake of being different or challenging for the sake of being challenging. No, God favors the different when it's necessarily so, when it's necessarily rooted in truth and love. In closing, will you declare this statement with me? I am different for the sake of truth and love. All right, let's try it together. I am different for the sake of truth and love. Good, let that settle into your bones. Let's do it one more time. I am different for the sake of truth and love. So good. May we walk in the footsteps of John the Baptist, who was clearly and queerly different, to honor the God who is both truth and love. Amen.